All right, class, today we're going to take our first set of notes. We will be talking about the American Republic, so how we became a nation in the first place. I title all of our notes so that you can find them and you can organize them. They will always have the unit and then the set of notes. So this is our first unit, which is Unit 1, and then it's our first set of notes. It'll be 1.1. Our next notes will be 1.2, 1.3, and so on. For each set of notes, I want you to have a title. I always put the title on the first slide, and I want you to have an essential question. Now, I do think it's best to take Cornell notes, but I'm going to let you take notes in whatever way you prefer. You can write them, or you can do them online on a document. Either way, you will have a set of notes for each one of these. I'm going to go ahead and present these slides. And I'm going to turn on the closed caption so that everybody can see them down at the bottom. All right, so notes 1.1, Birth of the American Republic. Your essential question: how did England's treatment of the American colonies lead to the Revolution? So when we started out, we were a set of colonies of England. We were an English territory under the rule of King George III. In 1760, King George decided he wanted to reassert the powers of the crown. He was fighting a very expensive war in the middle of what we now call the United States against both the French and the native populations. So wars are very expensive. In order for him to pay for this war, he decided he was going to increase the taxes that the American colonies were paying. This led to a huge dissatisfaction between the colonists because they had to pay higher taxes for a war that they were not involved in. It had nothing to do with them necessarily. This war was called the French and Indian War, or the 7-Year War. And so they started taxing the Americans in different ways. These are two of the examples: the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. They started charging anything that had sugar in it, very popular ingredient back then as it is now. And the Stamp Act, so they decided any piece of paper had to have a stamp on it. So newspapers, any legal documents, things that you were mailing, all had to have a stamp, and you had to pay those taxes to the British. So the the American colonists were getting very upset about this. And this all came to a head in Boston on March 5th, 1770. Some of the citizens of Boston were at a local pub. They were getting a little rowdy, and they decided to start throwing bottles at the British soldiers. The British soldiers responded by opening fire, and they killed 5 of those colonists, 5 of those citizens of Boston. The event was used as a rallying cry for revolutionaries to fight back against the British to gain their independence, and it led to the Boston Tea Party. This was an act of defiance against the British. Americans went and they took the tea that was from the British and they threw it into the Boston Harbor. They said they will not be taxed without representation. No taxation without representation. They wanted to be a part of their government as well. And as you can see, this is a bunch of Boston citizens, and they're wearing native headdresses. Now, these native headdresses were to disguise them as Native Americans in case they got caught. Pretty racist, right? So there's a Schoolhouse Rock video that kind of sums this up. I'm going to go ahead and play that for you now.
Swishing and a splashing over the horizon, what can it be? The pilgrims sailed the sea to find a place to call their own. In their ship Mayflower, they hoped to find a better home. They finally knocked on Plymouth Rock, and someone said, "We're there." It may not look like home, but at this point I don't care. Oh, they were missing Mother England. They swore their loyalty until the very end. Anything you say, King, it's okay, King. You know it's kind of scary on your own. Gonna build a new land the way we planned. Could you help us run it till it's grown? They planted corn, you know, they built their houses one by one. And bit by bit they worked until the colonies were done. They looked around, yeah, up and down, and someone said, hooray! If the king could only see us now, he would be proud of us today. They knew that now they'd run their own land. But George III still vowed he'd rule them to the end. Anything I say, do it my way now. Anything I say, do it my way. Don't you get to feeling independent, 'cause I'm gonna force you to obey. He taxed their property, he didn't give them any choice. And back in England, he didn't give them any voice. That's called taxation without representation, and it's not fair. But when the colonies complained, the king said, I don't care. He even has the nerve to tax our cup of tea. To put it kindly, King, we really don't agree. Gonna show you how we feel. We're gonna dump this tea and turn this harbor into the biggest cup of tea in history. They wanted no more mothering England. They knew the time had come for them to take command. It's very clear you're being unfair, King. No matter what you say, we won't obey. Gonna hold a revolution now, King, and we're gonna run it all away with no more king.
We're going to elect a president.
No more king.
He's going to do what the people want.
No more king.
We're going to run things our way.
No more king.
Nobody's going to tell us what to do.
Rocking our rolling station and smashing over the horizon. What can it be? Looks like it's going to be a free country.
All right, everyone. So the American Revolution started with Paul Revere and his midnight ride. Now he said, the British are coming, the British are coming. He hopped on a horse from Boston and he let the people know that the British were on their way. So the first battle of the Revolutionary War was at Lexington and Concord. So this was in 1775. The British troops came to confiscate the weapons of the colonists who weren't paying their taxes, and what they ran into was an untrained, unorganized, very angry militia. But this ragtag army was able to defeat 700 British soldiers. There's another video if you want to watch it later on. It's another Schoolhouse Rock video. It's called The Shot Heard Round the World, about that midnight ride and the beginning of the war. So we crafted the Declaration of Independence. This was actually written by Thomas Jefferson, who would go on to become one of our first presidents. And he wrote this document and we all signed it, well, about 30 or so men signed it on July 4th, 1776. That is considered our birthday because it's the day that we adopted the Declaration of Independence and said that we will no longer be a part of England. So we would continue to fight the war until October 19th, 1781, when the British surrendered at Yorktown. We had help from the French and the French and the Spanish. Sorry, the French and the Spanish fighting the British, and that helped to that helped to have us win the war. We are finally a new nation. Now that we're our own country, we have to figure out how we were going to form our new nation, how we're going to make laws, how we're going to run things. And the first document that we had guiding our nation was called the Articles of Confederation in 1781. This gave Congress the ability to create laws, but they could not tax. It only had one branch of government, which was Congress. There was no power over the states. There was no national currency. So that means each different colony, or now state, would have their own money, which means New York would have different money from Virginia. So if you can imagine that today, that'd be like California having different money than Oregon or Nevada. And you'd have to switch your money every time you go to a different state. So you could see how that could get pretty annoying. There was also no army. Since we could not tax anyone, we were not able to pay back all of the war debt that we had accrued. We also could not raise any money to have an army. And citizens consider themselves citizens of a particular state, not American citizens. So they were citizens of New York, like I'm a New Yorker or I'm a Californian, but not a citizen of the United States. So the colonists decided we need to organize, or I should say the Americans, because that's what they were now. The Americans decided we need to change this, we need to amend the Articles of Confederation. So they got together at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And this was led by George Washington. Thomas Jefferson, although he wrote the Declaration of Independence, was not there at the Constitutional Convention. He was actually over in France. Those of you who remember from world history, France had their own revolution happening at the time, and Thomas Jefferson went over there to help them write a Declaration of Independence as well. So George Washington proposed the question, should we amend the Articles of Confederation or should we create a new constitution? And the representatives decided they wanted to create a new constitution. These people would become known as the Founding Fathers later on. They're some of the famous people that you see on our currency that we currently have. Thomas Jefferson, although he was not there, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He would go on to become our third president, and he's on the $2 bill. James Madison kept notebooks about the writing of the US Constitution, and he wrote some papers defending the Constitution called the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton wrote the majority of these papers. They were all written anonymously at the time. He is also on the $10 bill, and you may have heard of Hamilton recently. He is in a musical. There's a musical based on him. It's on Disney Plus now, called Hamilton. And he's on the $10 bill. And George Washington is on the $1 bill. He was our very first president. John Adams was also there. He was our second president. And Benjamin Franklin, finally. Benjamin Franklin never went on to become a president, but he is on the $100 bill. All about the Benjamins, right? He was a legislator, a philosopher, a scientist. Benjamin Franklin did a lot for the United States. So they crafted this new document called the Constitution of the United States of America. And it is known as the supreme law of the land. So this was created in 1788. It's a document that we still use to guide our nation today. It created what we call a federal republic. It is a type of democracy, a representative democracy. That means we vote for people to make laws for us. There was two different plans for the Constitution that they had to merge into one. The first was the Virginia Plan by James Madison. This called for a two-house legislature, a House of Representatives and a Senate. They wanted representation based on state population, and they wanted to have the federal government be able to tax. This was known as the large state plan because states that had bigger populations would be better off in this plan. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, had the New Jersey Plan. This had a one-house legislature, also had the ability to tax, and the same number of representatives regardless of size for the state. So the two of these merged together in what we call the Great Compromise into one plan, and it's what we still have today. So we still have two houses of legislature. We do have the House of Representatives that's based on population. California has the biggest population, so we get 53 members in the House of Representatives, and the Senate has 2 members for each state, so equal representation for every single state. They also had to compromise on slavery. Now, the South said that their enslaved population should be able to count as part of their population for the House of Representatives. Okay? But if those enslaved people counted, they would have more representation in Congress. The South actually had more enslaved people as part of their population than they had free people. So they decided what they were going to do was compromise. They called this the 3/5 compromise, and this meant that each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of representation for the House of Representatives. And I know you're thinking, how do you count a person as 3/5 of a person? Well, you got to think about it on a large scale. Like when we do the census, like we're doing right now, we count all the people that live in a certain state, in a certain city, in a certain area. So if we had 300 people, Actually, let's say if we had 500 people, they would count as 300 people in terms of representation for the House of Representatives. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists became our first two political parties. The Federalists supported the Constitution and a strong federal government. The Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution, and they believed in strong state governments. The Constitution has 6 basic principles: popular sovereignty, which means the government gets its power from the people. If the people don't like the government, they can remove them. Limited government, the government only has as much power as the people give it. People can remove their representatives from office. They can veto laws, things like that. Separation of powers. That means certain powers are given to each branch of government. We have 3 specific branches of government to maintain a separation of powers so that we don't have one person, like a king, being all powerful. And this provides us with our system of checks and balances. Each of these 3 individual branches can check the others if necessary. You'll learn a lot more about that when you get into government next year. We also have the power of judicial review, so our courts have the ability to review acts of the government and cancel any laws that they consider unconstitutional. And then we also have federalism, so power is divided between the federal government in Washington, D.C., and the state governments that we have in each individual state, like right here in Sacramento. This is the breakdown of the Constitution. And the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. These protect our citizens. So all of these protect us as individuals from our government. Now, a lot of people are getting confused, especially nowadays, with things like wearing a mask, and they're saying that's against the Bill of Rights, that's against their constitutional rights. But companies don't abide by the Constitution. This is our protections from the government, not from individual companies, private institutions like grocery stores. And that's an overview of the Bill of Rights. That's the end of your notes, so make sure you go ahead and write a summary at the end. You're just going to need a couple of sentences describing what it is that you just learned. And that's it.